Hey, welcome back to Slow Bells. Today I am in Amsterdam. I'm not sure if it's Amsterdam in the Netherlands or the Amsterdam in New York State, but I'm pretty sure it's one or the other. It is a rainy day here, which means it is not all that great a day for traveling and going through locks on the Erie Canal, but it is a great day for editing videos. So that's what I'm doing. Today I'm going to show you the section of the trip from basically Baltimore to New York City. That means we're going to finish off the Chesapeake Bay, go through the C&D Canal, down Delaware Bay, up the Jersey coast, and right through New York City on the Hudson River. I'm also going to talk a little bit about checklists that I use on my boat and give you a practical example of some of my morning checks that I do. Check it out. Rick and I left our anchorage near Baltimore Saturday morning and headed north up the bay. The width of the bay was gradually shrinking, and that trend would continue for the remainder of our time on the Chesapeake. We anchored around lunchtime in the Sassafras River. It was very warm that afternoon, but early enough in the summer that the bugs were not really a problem yet. The next morning, it was pretty much the same drill. Get the anchor up, motor a little further north, then send down the anchor once again. This time, our anchorage was in the Bohemia River, which was filled to capacity with fast-moving fishing boats, fast-moving jet skis, and a whole lot of wake that kept my boat rocking all afternoon until things finally settled down in the evening. On Memorial Day, we finished up our time on the Chesapeake Bay and headed east across the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal. The canal has a bit of a reputation for strong tidal currents and squeezing past huge ocean-going ships in a relatively narrow channel. But the 3 times I have passed through here, I don't think I ever encountered anything larger than a tug and barge. The current can slow you down, but it's nothing that the average trawler can't handle. And for a canal, it's pretty damn wide. Can you imagine how long it must have taken them to dig a canal this wide and deep enough for ocean-going ships? We pulled into Delaware City Marina about mid-afternoon on a pretty warm day. Pleasure boats headed south down Delaware Bay tend to accumulate here at the marina until the weather is right, and then they make a mad dash down to Cape May, which is roughly a 55-mile trip. Unlike the Chesapeake, Delaware Bay has practically no marinas or attractive anchorages along its shores, unless your boat only draws a foot or so of water. The current is significant, which can either be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on whether you are traveling with it or against it. The waves can also be a problem, especially if the wind is blowing against the tidal current. The Delaware City Marina staff give a weather briefing each evening for the following day, along with advice for when or if you should begin your sprint down to Cape May. Rick left the boat in Delaware City, heading off in a rental car for his next big adventure, this one in New York City. I had a nice walk that morning. The walking trail starts off along a very shallow channel that used to be part of the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal. The trail then continues for several miles along the shoreline of the current C&D Canal. On my early morning walk, I saw fox, deer, geese, and several rabbits along the trail. These things protruding from the tree bark look something like some kind of a mushroom. But don't be fooled. They are really teeny tiny rain shelters built by the squirrels. The squirrels tried carrying umbrellas for a while on rainy days, but when you climb trees for a living, the umbrellas just don't work out all that well. Also on my walk, I passed this turtle who is training for an upcoming iron turtle competition. This grueling race requires the turtles to complete a 1/10 of a mile race course within 17 hours. I got the impression that this turtle was still in the early stages of his training program. After a hot, steamy afternoon, we got a hailstorm later that day. Several trawlers departed the Delaware City Marina the following morning, bound for Cape May. We had good weather all day as we motored along, watching the barges, ships, and lighthouses pass by. If you enter Cape May from the west, you will go past a large ferry boat terminal, then through a 3.5 mile canal that eventually spits you out into a little bay filled with marinas and tour boats. I anchored for the night with several other boats near the Coast Guard station. Late in the evening, we had another thunderstorm, this one with unusually strong winds. The winds were strong enough to drive the sailboat ashore. There was no one aboard the boat when it was driven ashore, and I noticed that it was re-anchored back in deeper water the following day. The next day, I headed into Uch's Marina. I took on fuel, ended up buying a new cell phone with more internal memory space, stocked up on groceries, and I managed to purchase a new VHF radio just before closing time at West Marine. It was a busy day. Here's one way to keep your boat from rubbing on a piling. You just locate a fender in a horizontal position and hope that your boat doesn't move more than a couple inches one way or the other. A better solution is to use a fender board, which requires a 2x4 spanning a distance between two different fenders. This allows your boat to move quite a bit more fore and aft without losing the protection of the fender board. A pleasure boater has a couple options to get from Cape May to Sandy Hook, which is just south of New York City, a distance of about 130 miles. One option is to do part of the trip along an inland waterway that follows the coast and then finish up the trip out in the Atlantic Ocean. This has the advantage of being a series of shorter days in protected waters, but has the disadvantage of passing through many areas of shallow water. Another option is to wait for good weather, then go out in the ocean and sprint up to Sandy Hook. I prefer to do the whole trip out in the ocean, but over a 2-day period, with a stop on the first afternoon into Atlantic City for the night. This results in one 40-mile day to Atlantic City and then a second 90-mile day to Sandy Hook. By the way, those distances are in statute miles, not nautical miles. I left Cape May on an overcast morning with light winds and headed north along the Atlantic coastline. I never get more than 2 or 3 miles from shore, so land is always in sight, unless you run into rain or fog. In light winds, the Atlantic Ocean is pretty much like the Chesapeake Bay, except that there are typically low ocean swells that quietly pass under your boat all day. In Atlantic City, I tried out an anchorage I had never been in before. Brigantine Anchorage is on the eastern side of the Absecon Inlet, across from Atlantic City. It is well protected, but has an uncomfortably narrow, twisting entrance. I used the Navionics sonar charts to get in near high tide and managed to avoid going aground. A few days later, I tiptoed out of that same narrow, twisting channel and headed over to Cameron's Marina to pick up my next shipmate, Lynn. Lynn and I had cruised down part of the ICW the previous year, and I was delighted to have him back on board again. The forecast for the next day was a little iffy. The afternoon winds were forecast to be gusting up to 20 knots. Lynn and I discussed the forecast and decided to get an early start to take advantage of the lighter winds in the morning. The afternoon winds would be pushing us toward Sandy Hook, which was a good thing. Our passage up the Jersey shore went well, and we pulled into our anchorage at Atlantic Highlands around dinner time. The following morning, we headed towards New York City and the Hudson River. New York City is always an interesting part of the trip, highlighted by the Statue of Liberty and the Manhattan skyline. But it's a busy place with all the high-speed ferry boats and tug traffic. I tried to stay out of the main channel on the west side of the Hudson River, and I yield right-of-way to all the commercial traffic. Here's something I've never seen before: an electric billboard on a barge anchored in the middle of the Hudson River. You just can't get away from the advertising these days. North of New York City, the shoreline becomes more rural and more hilly as you make your way north up the Hudson River. We stopped that afternoon in Half Moon Bay Marina in a town called Croton-on-Hudson. It would be a long time before slow bells passed through saltwater again, but we would continue to deal with tidal fluctuations all the way to Albany. I may have the distinction of having the worst memory of anyone doing the Great Loop. To compensate for my lousy memory, I use checklists on my boat. These checklists detail the many things that I need to do before pulling away from the dock in the morning, and a few items that need to be done at the end of the day. I also have checklists for the actions needed to do certain things on my Garmin chart plotter, some of which are a long series of steps that I have difficulty in remembering. such as changing the display from north up to the direction of travel up. A side benefit of checklists is that they provide my crew with information on what needs to be done each morning before heading out. This is especially true for a crew member who is new to the boat, and they tend to be a little overwhelmed with all the things that have to be done every morning. One section of my checklist deals with morning engine room checks. These checks are pretty typical of what the average trawler or sailboat owner will be doing each morning before starting the engine. But before we start checking the engines, let me give you a quick tour of my engine room. On my boat, the engine room is under the floor of the main cabin. This arrangement gives me pretty good access to the engines once the floor covers are removed. The downside of this arrangement is you end up with a very noisy main cabin when the engines are running. There are 3 diesel engines on my boat. The 2 big ones are 135 horsepower Ford engines. Their job is to push my boat around the Great Loop and recharge my 12-volt batteries, which are similar to the batteries in your car. The third engine is a little 4.4 kW Westerbeek generator, which generates 120-volt electricity, just like the electricity in your house. This 120-volt power runs all sorts of stuff, like a battery charger, air conditioner, refrigerator, hot water heater, and anything else that will plug into a 120-volt electrical outlet. I have 2 monster-sized 12-volt batteries, one to start the engine and one for everything else, like running the refrigerator and my 12-volt lights. I have a separate battery to start my generator. There are 2 fuel tanks on my boat, each one located outboard of my main engines. Both tanks supply fuel to this cylinder-shaped manifold, and then various valves control the flow of fuel through 3 fuel filters and then to the 3 diesel engines. The engines circulate antifreeze inside the engine, similar to your car. There is also seawater being pumped through the engine for cooling. The antifreeze never touches the seawater, but this heat exchanger allows some of the heat in the antifreeze to be transferred to the seawater. The diesel exhaust is then combined with the seawater cooling, and it's all pumped overboard out the end of my boat. At the back of the main engines, there's a transmission, but it's not a 5-speed automatic transmission like your car. It just has forward, neutral, and reverse. These hoses are used to cool the transmission fluid. The propeller shaft runs from the transmission to the propeller. This requires a hole in my boat for the propeller shaft to pass through. These stuffing boxes create a mostly watertight seal around the hole in my boat, allowing a tiny bit of water to flow around the propeller shaft to keep it cool while it's turning. This 4th fuel filter and the fuel pump above it is part of a fuel scrubber system that will pull fuel out of my diesel tanks, pass it through this filter, and then dump the clean fuel back into the diesel tanks. These 3 seawater filters make sure that seaweed, plastic grocery bags, and small whales don't end up inside my engine's seawater cooling piping. Finally, this metal box is a little hot water heater for showers and dishwashing. This hot water heater can generate heat from either 120-volt electricity or from the hot antifreeze circulating inside my starboard engine when it's running. Now that you have a better understanding of what's in my engine room, let's run through my morning engine room checklist. I begin by pulling a few napkins out of my napkin stash, courtesy of the local restaurants I visit. There's also a flashlight nearby. The first check is to take a peek inside the bilge to see if my boat is sinking. The outcome of this check can have a profound impact on the rest of my day. Next, I check the oil level in all three engines. The dipstick on the generator is a little challenging to access, but it can be done. The dipsticks on the two Ford engines are located on the inboard side of both engines, so it's easy to check their oil levels. Next, I check the belt tension of all three engines. These belts are similar to the fan belts on your car. Next, I make sure the seacocks are open so my engines can get plenty of that nice cold seawater. Next, I check the antifreeze level in these little expansion tanks. Next, I check my seawater strainers for seaweed, plastic grocery bags, or those pesky small whales. Next, I check the level of the transmission fluid. Next, I make sure I haven't lost any bolts to keep my propeller shaft attached to my engine. It is so inconvenient to lose one of these propeller shafts. The last thing I check in the engine room is the position of the many fuel cutoff valves. I also check the level of fuel in both fuel tanks, and I record those fuel levels each morning in my white notebook. Well, that about wraps up this episode of the Slow Bell series. Next time, tune in, and we will be running up the Hudson River towards the Erie Canal. Later.